everybody. I appreciate your coming out for this celebration, or that's what it is for us. But I was also thinking as I was coming over here, with all the talk now in Alabama and Louisiana about keeping the residents of places alive, keeping the culture of a place, not let it disappear because of the flood. It's rather appropriate that we are here today to try to keep the memories alive of things that if we hadn't been interested might not have continued until this day. I started to start off by saying, a long time ago, you know, you have a fairy story, a long time ago. Well, a long time ago, when I was a graduate student at Radcliffe, I came up on the hill. I knew that blacks had lived up there, not because they were there, mind you, but because I had read a few books that said they had been there at one time. When I came, the church, the meeting house, was a synagogue, and not a very active synagogue at that. The building next to it was boarded up with a faded sign saying GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. And I looked around to see where were all the people who used to have lived here. So there was a book that I looked at called Freedom's Birthplace by a man named John Daniels. Some of you may know it. And I took that book out and began to retrace the steps that he had pointed out about the community of blacks who had lived there. Now, as we know, Boston was a very exciting city, as New Orleans was, for different reasons, obviously. But the people who came up here were outstanding people. They weren't just ordinary people. They were really leaders who had been here. So I was concerned that there was no visible mark of their presence there. As I always say to friends who will listen to me, how would we know that George Washington slept here if we didn't have a sign that said George Washington slept there? So I thought it was time to put George Washington to sleep. I thought it was time that we would begin to mark these places so people would know. So I belong to a club of women, and we're all friends. As far as I know, we liked each other all these years. At least I hope so. And I went back to my friends, and I said, you know, I think among our other projects, we should take on the project of establishing the presence of blacks who lived on the Hill. So we were 15 young women, 15 black women, most of them in the academic or business world, some born in Boston, some not born in Boston, who supported the idea that I had, that our club called the Heritage Guild appropriately. I won't tell you the name we had before that, but it's Heritage Guild now. We would take on as our project the marking of some of these houses where blacks lived. Now, simultaneously with my doing this, Mrs. Sue Thurman, Howard Thurman's wife, as you may know, was, I don't know just how she happened to decide upon the museum, or the synagogue actually, as a place that should be vitalized. But we were sort of working in tandem. She was concerned about revitalizing that synagogue into the church that it had been, and my club members, we were concerned with marking the buildings. So this today represents our 12th holiday, our 12th celebration. And if you have looked at the brochure, which I won't bother to bore you with hearing me read, you will see the ones we've done before. We've had a few of the people here who were owners of the houses that we've marked. And I want to say before sort of concluding on my introductory remarks, that over the years, I never had anybody, no owner ever turn us down. And I think the owners were surprised that they didn't move in those houses thinking that they would be members of the NAACP. They moved in the houses because the house they wanted. And all of a sudden, I pop up and say, you know who lives in that house before you live there? And then we educate them. So the first step was to tell the people whose house they were living in, to then work on a wording for the plaque that might go up there. And then 3, to go to the Beacon Hill Historical Commission, if the house was on Beacon Hill. They weren't all on Beacon Hill, but most of them were. And get their approval to have the plaque put up there. We, of course, were paying for the plaque. Then after that approval was given, then we had to go to the Boston engineers to get one of those big green stickers. I never know why they need one of those big ones to put on the window, but they do. building permit. And then we had to contract with an engraver to design the plaque, and then we had to get it up. And then if we were still of one piece, we decided to have a celebration. And we've had several celebrations at the Meeting House. We've also had them at one of the homes of the person, and we've also had one at Boston University. But this is the first time we've done anything jointly with another institution. And I think because we sort of work together, it's appropriate that we should be doing it with the museum. Of course, one of our members is also, who's the director of the museum, is also a member of our club, so sort of crisscrossing there, cross-fertilization, we might say, so that it's come reaching the right point. And I now want to introduce Beverly to you. You all know her anyhow, but she's the director of the museum, and she has organized this with us to bring you here. I guess before I sit down, I don't know how many of our members are here. I hate people do this to me, but if any of the members of the Heritage Guild are here, would you mind standing so the rest of you will know who you are? Okay. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, I will turn the meeting over to Beverly, who is a member and also a Smith graduate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here today as both a member of the Heritage Guild and as Executive Director of the Museum of Afro-American History. I don't think that there are many of you who may not know of the museum's 4 historic sites, but it is imperative that I always mention them as they are with me in my dreams. It is both the African Meeting House and the Higginbotham House on Nantucket, and of course, as Dr. Cromwell mentioned, the African Meeting House and the A.B.L. Smith School here in Boston. It is a privilege for many reasons today. David Walker and Mariah Stewart are 2 of the most important leaders in the Boston Black community. The research that was done, I see, Horace, is that your head back there? I can remember the first time Horace came in to say research was being done. Michael Terranova is always at the center of that research as well. And lo and behold, to find this place, to mark this place that had been the home of both David Walker and Mariah Stewart was an amazing moment. We often ask people to try to imagine what it must have been like to live on the north slope of Beacon Hill in the 19th century. The wonderful thing is that we don't have to imagine what it was like, because both in the case of David Walker and Mariah Stewart, they have left us their words. We want to begin the program today by introducing David Walker to you once again, and I will use here the words of Peter Hinks. Few knew the world of Black America as thoroughly as did David Walker. He may well have traveled the length and breadth of the new nation and been exposed to its racial horrors in various settings, north and south. Probably in or about 1796, Walker was born free in Wilmington, North Carolina, apparently to a free Black woman and a male enslaved. No records of his birth or of his parents remain. Nothing is known with certainty of his years in Wilmington, but the town and the entire region along the lower Cape Fear River in the southeastern corner of the state were filled with both slavery at its most brutal and African Americans at their most resourceful and independent. By 1825, Walker had settled in Boston. He appeared in the city directory for that year and every following year until his death in 1830. he quickly established a small used clothing business, an enterprise that more and more local blacks were entering in the latter years of the 1820s. By February 1826, Walker had married Eliza Butler, a local woman. By July of the same year, he had been initiated into the Prince Hall, or African Masonry, at Boston's famous African Lodge, number 459. He also joined a local Black Methodist church shepherded by the fiery and beloved anti-slavery minister Samuel Snowden, who after 1831 became a key ally of William Lloyd Garrison. In the short space of 2 years, Walker had risen significantly into prominence in Black Boston and had become an important community activist. He was the principal agent in Boston for the first Black newspaper in the United States, Freedom's Journal, and he rallied critical support for it in its early months in 1827. Along with his fellow Lodge brothers, he helped organize and police several parades or African celebrations on Beacon Hill's North Slope in the late 1820s. Boy, that's something I'd love to see now. There were new objectives for African Americans to promote aggressively and publicly the abolition of slavery and the intellectual and moral improvement of blacks in America, and to do so by encouraging African Americans to join together in one body, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the nation. By 1829, Black Boston increasingly delegated to David Walker the authority to express its deepest held sorrow, anger, and aspirations. Later that year, in September, David Walker published the first edition of his Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. In one response in the Boston Evening Transcript from the Black community, quote, "They glory in its principles as if it were a star in the east, guiding them to freedom and emancipation." Ladies and gentlemen, David Walker.
The selection of David Walker's speeches are taken from the Appeal to the Colored Citizens of America, as well as a reprinted speech of his found in the Freedom's Journal of December 1828. Although they were written for a specific audience and a specific context, they are as contemporary, practical, and alive today as they were then. While these Spaniards are running about in the field of battle, cutting each other's throats, has not the Lord seen the afflicted and suffering people in the midst of them, whose cries and groans in consequence of oppression and continual groan is crying out to the ears of the God of justice? Would they not cease to cut each other's throats? But how can they? The very support which they draw from government to aid them is perpetuating such great enormities. Does it not arise in great degree from the victims of oppression among them? And yet, they are calling for peace? Peace. But some may even think that our white brethren and friends are making such mighty efforts for the amelioration of our condition that we may stand as neutral spectators of their work. Now, all that great work, indeed, from our good friends, whom God has given us, I do humbly acknowledge, and very gratefully. Yes, Mr. President, it is indispensably our duty to try every scheme that we will think of toward the tendency to facilitate our salvation, and leave the final result to that God who holds the destinies of people in the hollow of his hand, and whomever and has ever will repay every nation, according to its works.
Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Robinson. Mariah Stewart. Mariah Stewart. The first African American and the first American-born woman to speak publicly to a gender-mixed audience was an ardent champion of women's rights and African American freedom. Freeborn in Hartford in 1803, Mariah Miller was orphaned at age 5 when she was bound out as a, quote, domestic apprentice to a clergyman's family. At the age of 15, she became an independent domestic worker and pursued her education through Sabbath schools. Mariah Miller moved to Boston before her marriage to James W. Stewart in 1826 at the African Meeting House. 3 years later, James Stewart, who was a shipping agent, died. White executors of his will defrauded his widow of her inheritance. In 1830, Mariah Stewart had a religious conversion experience that made her a strong advocate for freedom and for women's rights. From 1832 to 1833, Mariah Stewart gave 4 public lectures in Boston, the first before the, I love this, Afro-American Female Intelligence Society, and the celebrated second before the New England Anti-Slavery Society. All 4 addresses were published in the Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison also published 2 of her pamphlets on religious topics in 1831 and 1832, and a collection of her public speeches, Productions of Mrs. Mariah W. Stewart, in 1835. When members of the Boston African American community criticized her role as a public spokeswoman, her religious orientation, and her feminist exhortations, Mariah Stewart decided to move to New York City. After leaving Boston, Stewart became a teacher for the remainder of her life. She taught in Manhattan and then in Brooklyn. In 1852, she moved to Baltimore and tutored individual students. In 1861, she moved to Washington, D.C. There she taught in the public schools during the Civil War and began to work at the Freedmen's Hospital. In the 1870s, while continuing her teaching career, she became a matron at Freedmen's Hospital. In 1871, she opened a Sunday school for poor children, raising $200 for its building. In the last year of her life, she successfully applied for a pension as a War of 1812 widow. Seeking documentation of her marriage, she returned briefly to Boston, where she visited with William Lloyd Garrison. Ladies and gentlemen, Mariah Stewart.
Thank you very much, Beverly. That was a very fine introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803, was left an orphan, 5 years of age, was bound out in a clergyman's family, and had the seeds of piety and virtue early sown in my mind. But I was deprived of the advantages of an education, though my soul thirsted for knowledge. I left them at 15 years of age, attended Sabbath schools until I was 20, and in 1826 was married to James W. Stewart. I was left a widow in 1829, and as I humbly hope and trust, I was brought to the knowledge of truth as it is in 1830. In 1831, I made a public profession of my faith in Christ. If I may, I would like to read from one of my writings, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build. I wrote this in 1831. Feeling a deep solemnity of soul in view of our wretched and degraded situation, and sensible of the gross ignorance that prevails among us, I have thought proper this publicly to express my sentiments before you. I hope my friends will not scrutinize these pages with too severe an eye, as I have not calculated to display either elegance or taste in their composition, but have merely written the meditations of my heart as far as my imagination led, and have presented them before you in order to arouse you to exertion and to enforce upon your minds the great necessity of turning your attention to knowledge and improvement. All the nations of the earth are crying out for liberty and equality. Away, away with tyranny and oppression. And shall Afric's sons be silent any longer? Far be it from me to recommend to you either to kill, burn, or destroy, but I would strongly recommend to you to improve your talents. Let not one lie buried in the earth. Show forth your powers of mind. This is the land of freedom. The press is at liberty. Every man has a right to express his opinion. Many think because your skins are tinged with a sable hue that you are an inferior race of beings. But God does not consider you as such. He hath formed and fashioned you in his own glorious image, and has bestowed upon you reason and strong powers of intellect. And according to the Constitution of the United States, he hath made all men free and equal. Then why should one worm say to another, keep you down there while I sit up yonder, for I am better than thou? It is not the color of the skin that makes the man, but it is the principles formed within the soul. Many will suffer for pleading the cause of oppressed Africa, and I shall glory in being one of its martyrs. For I am firmly persuaded that the God in whom I trust is able to protect me from the rage and malice of mine enemies, and from them that will rise up against me. And if there is no other way for me to escape, he is able to make and take me to himself, as he did the most noble, fearless, and undaunted David Walker. My respected friends, I feel almost unable to address you, almost incompetent to perform the task. And at times I have felt ready to exclaim, oh, that my head were waters and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the transgressions of the daughters of my people. Truly, my heart's desire and prayer is that Ethiopia might stretch forth her hands unto God. But we have a great work to do. No, never, never will the chains of slavery and ignorance burst till we become united as one and cultivate among ourselves the pure principles of piety, morality, and virtue. I am sensible of my ignorance, but such knowledge as God has given to me, I impart to you. I am sensible of former prejudices, but it is high time for prejudice and animosities to cease from among us. I am sensible of exposing myself to calumny and reproach. But shall I, for fear of feeble man who shall die, hold my peace? Shall I, for fear of scoffs and frowns, refrain my tongue? Ah, no. Thank you.
Lamerchi Frazier, our Director of Education. It is no coincidence that our guest speaker is with us today. I mention now that while the two people that we honor were never enslaved, that we did a historic structures report with the National Park Service and looked at the sites on Beacon Hill and found that everyone was taking people in. If you noted a journal, there were journal entries that said, saw an enslaved man who might have been enslaved today, invited him home. Oh, would that maybe we're getting tested to be the same nation now. There were entries in the Vigilance Committee logs of giving people funds to pay for clothing, food, and shelter for those who had arrived in Boston and who had been enslaved. I have the pleasure of introducing a colleague, a man who attended Brown University and who I think was the youngest director of a Smithsonian museum, the Museum of American History, and who now is the CEO of the Underground Railroad, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. It is important to me to note that Spencer Crewe is a man who is envied in the history world. Not everyone wants to deal with the facts of what it takes to direct a museum, and there are many aspects of that. And there are those of us who have watched him found and build an institution from scratch. He has done that not only with the funding, but with the education and interpretive programs and the exhibits that match the powerful history with an incredibly, wonderfully told story. He is a man of great integrity. He is a wonderful colleague, and he has changed the face of American museums in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, Spencer Crewe.
Thank you, Beverly. I'm not quite sure who that guy is, but I appreciate the introduction. What I want to do today is to talk about people who cherish freedom, people who embraced that right very seriously and took action to make it accessible, and who were not quiet or retiring about its importance and its crucial nature in their society and in our society today. I can begin with the two people that you are honoring today, David Walker and Mariah Stewart, who each in their own way were tireless fighters for freedom and for the rights of others. And as such, they deserve our praise and recognition as very special individuals. And I think your recognition of them today is quite appropriate and correct in listening and honoring their activities. But in many ways, they were not alone in their dedication to these ideals, especially during the period in which they existed during the 19th century. There were many others as well in their community, and communities all across the United States who shared that passion, who shared that belief, and made great sacrifices during their lifetimes to help others gain freedom and take steps on their own to gain freedom for themselves and for their family members. And this is especially true when we think about and consider the issue of slavery and bondage, which were the key issues of their time. If you think of the 19th century, you have to think about the impact of slavery and the abolitionists and those who were involved in this process of creating freedom for others. These were the people who were abolitionists and people who participated in the Underground Railroad, who I think were a very special, unique group of individuals. They represent one of the first interracial activist movements in the history of this nation. But it's also, I think, one of the most misunderstood and understudied activities that we've ever had take place in our country. In many ways, the Underground Railroad is almost a mythical entity in the history of the United States. It is shrouded in mystery, filled with people who are part of it, and the description of it includes people who are sort of shadowy figures walking in the background, doing marvelous things for this country. Stories about who were part of it, what routes were followed, what buildings were used, how many people escaped are numerous and manifold. And we're still not clear about how much of it is true, how much of it is mythology, how much of it was just the figmentation of people's minds. I think what happens, though, is that it creates wonderful stories and folk tales about these individuals and these activities all across the country. I think it creates stories of wonderful heroes and sheroes in the history of our nation who make huge sacrifices for themselves and for others in the name of freedom. I think this makes for wonderful stories and wonderful folklore for this nation. But it also makes it much more difficult to create an understanding of what this activity was actually about, who the people were who were part of it, what are the places that were a part of it, and what's the true story of this history of the Underground Railroad. In fact, even historians are not clear exactly when this activity begins. If you go back and talk to different historians and look at their work, the period for when they think the Underground Railroad really gets going, really gets functioning, is under dispute. If you look at John Hope Franklin, the work that he's done, he really thinks that the Underground Railroad gets its start sometime around 1804, 1805 at the turn of the century, as he begins to see more and more people escaping, and he begins to see some indication of support for these individuals during that escape. Many others look to a later period. They look to the 1830s, to the 1860s, and say this is really this true period of the Underground Railroad when you have many more people functioning in this activity and who are making an impact in terms of the lives of those who are trying to gain freedom. But what we do know, I could say, is that no matter what date you put to it, as long as there was slavery in this nation, there were people who were seeking to escape it and people who were seeking to help them in their attempts to gain that freedom. And that, whether official or not, was an underground railroad, a system of people working together to gain freedom for others. No one really knows how many individuals actually escaped as part of the Underground Railroad. It could be hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, but no one knows for certain. But what we do know is that only a small fraction of those who were enslaved in this country up to the Civil War. By the time of the Civil War, it's estimated that about 4 million individuals were enslaved in this country. So even if we say hundreds of thousands of individuals escaped on the Underground Railroad, it's a small amount within the larger number of people who were enslaved. So we're looking at a small impact, but what they represent, what they symbolize is important because it speaks to the fact that there were people who were not happy in that condition despite the pronouncements of those who were slave owners. And more importantly, it pointed out there were people all across the nation who did not believe in this system, did not believe in what others were doing to their fellow human beings, who very much strongly believed in the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, who believed that the words of liberty, equality, and freedom had real meaning, and that their application was not just to a chosen few, but it should be applied to all those who are part of our nation. So the question becomes, in this definition, in these activities, how does one truly define the Underground Railroad and its activities? Now, the traditional description is that it's a well-organized transportation system used by abolitionists and other conductors, sending multitudes of fugitive slaves to the promised land of freedom through ingenuity and daring and courage. I think the reality, though, is that it's much more complicated than that, not quite that romantic, and much more powerful in its impact. I think the best way of describing the Underground Railroad is is to think of it as a loosely organized group of individuals across the country who are working together to gain their freedom and to help those who are trying to gain their freedom do it successfully. And it stretched all the way from the Deep South through the North onto Canada. For those who to gain true freedom really had to get as far as Canada to feel they were truly free. The people who were part of this came from a wide variety of backgrounds. And I think as I talked about the interracial nature of this activism, that comes through very clearly. The people who were a part of it, who were attacking the institution of slavery in essence, came in a variety of colors, backgrounds, and geographic locations all across this country. But they all were united in the belief in the importance of the idea of freedom and its broad application to all of us and all of the people who lived during that era. And they were more than willing and did put their lives, their future, their well-being in jeopardy in order to make this happen. All for the cause of that idea, that ideal of freedom. And the risks that they are taking are truly serious, maybe even stronger than we realize it as we listen to the things that they were going through. Because, first of all, what they were doing is taking on the most formidable, powerful institution in our nation in the first half of the 19th century. Slavery is the dominant economic force in our nation during that time. Their political power is enormous. And if you stop and pause for a minute and think about it, you can understand its power. If you go through those presidents up through Lincoln, 11 of those presidents, there are 15 up until Lincoln, 11 of them are slave owners, so therefore sympathetic to the institution of slavery. Only 2 of those presidents really were opposed to the institution and publicly stood up against it in terms of their administration and their beliefs. Interestingly enough, they are from this area. They are the Adams, John and John Quincy Adams, who are stalwart opponents to the institution of slavery. Moreover, if you think about the economic impact of slavery in this nation during that period, if you were to combine all of the economic activities in this country, all the commercial activities, the banking activities, maritime, industrial, railroad activities, combine their wealth and their value together, their combined worth would not equal the value of the slaves that lived in this, that were in this country during that time period. Slavery is the most important economic engine of this nation during that time period. During this time, the United States produced about 7/8 of all the cotton that's produced around the world. As a friend of mine has described it, at that time we were the OPEC of cotton in this country during that period. It made cotton and slavery enormously influential in the United States. And even those who were not directly owning slaves were influenced by its impact. And therefore, deciding to work against it, deciding to take on the role of undercutting slavery, was in fact to put yourself against the tide of the feeling and the beliefs of this nation, and certainly going against the economic well-being of a lot of people. So as a consequence, the decision to decide to oppose this institution is not a minor one. It's not one that one takes lightly. In fact, you are facing a very powerful force if you choose to do this. Everyone engaged in Underground Railroad activities was taking a huge risk upon themselves and their families and their future. And for each person, those risks took a slightly different form, but they were very real and very imposing. As you think about the players in the Underground Railroad, you can begin to, I think, divide them into certain groups and understand what the nature of their exposure was, what the nature of their danger was in their work. And probably the most important individuals to think about, the ones that are often most overlooked, are those individuals who decide to escape slavery and to seek their own freedom, the enslaved African Americans who lived in the South. Very often, they are individuals who are overlooked and not thought about, and are sort of shut off to one side. In fact, for many years in the history of the Underground Railroad, most of the focus was on the abolitionists and the conductors. And the slaves themselves were sort of seen as helpless individuals who were helped and supported by others to have the courage to take the steps to try to gain their freedom. Helpless victims pushed along by the forces of history. But as we know now, that reality is very different, significantly different. Slaves are much more proactive, much more engaged than they ever were portrayed early on. And if you look at the profile of who they are and what they're doing, it's a very interesting, I think, picture of who these individuals are. First of all, the majority of those who escape tend to be young men in their teens and their 20s. And most often, they tend to escape from border states, places like Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, places near northern states. Now, there are variations in this characterization, obviously, because women escape, children escape, older people escape, but they tended to be younger males. And this profile gives you a sense of who the individuals who are beginning to make that escape. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the risks that they face in terms of doing this and why this profile tends to be this way. Because the choice is a difficult one, not an easy one, as you might think. A lot of us probably look back and think, gosh, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't tolerate it. I would step away, gain my freedom no matter what the risks. But often it's easier to do that in the abstract than to do it in the actuality. Because I think as you listen to the stories about those who are involved, you understand more and more how much risk they take on. And there are many wonderful stories about these individuals. People like Henry Box Brown, who you all may know, a slave who lives in Richmond, Virginia, who once his family is sold into slavery decides he can no longer tolerate the institution, plus he doesn't have those ties to bind him. So what he's able to do is to convince a carpenter in Richmond to build a box in which he was going to have himself nailed in and shipped from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a trip of about 26 hours. And I think it's an indication of his dedication and his willingness to put himself at risk to find a different life for himself. Now, I think it's a really wonderful story if you think about him just getting in the box. The box is taken to the train station, and he arrives in Philadelphia in 26 hours. It sounds a little tough, but it's not all that hard. But the reality of it is much different. The fact is that, first of all, he's in a box that's probably no bigger than this high. He's 5 feet 9 inches tall and almost 200 pounds. So first of all, it's a tight fit. But secondly, in the course of this 26 hours, in several occasions, despite the fact that they clearly mark on the box this side up, he's turned upside down on his head. And in reading his story, he talks about almost passing out because of the blood rushing to his head. And it's only good fortune that he's flipped over again. And by the time he gets to Philadelphia and he's taken from the box, he really takes a long time to begin to recover back from it. But I think it speaks to his dedication and his resolve to gain his freedom. Other stories are parallel to that. Right here in Boston, you very well know the story of William and Ellen Craft, who disguised themselves as a young slave owner with this slave who traveled by train, by boat, and then by train again from Georgia to Philadelphia and finally settled here in Boston. And when they get here, they begin to lecture on their experiences to let people know, one, how much they hated the institution of slavery and why they were willing to put themselves at risk to try to gain their freedom. And for a while, they even live here with Lewis Hayden, who you have honored as part of your program previously. Eventually, they move to England because they have to escape Boston as their former slave owner finds about their location and begins to send individuals here to try to recapture them. So they're constantly in peril, constantly in danger, but are willing to live with that in the hopes of having their freedom and a better future for themselves and possibly their family. I think these are exciting stories, stimulating stories, the kinds of things I think that give us all heart about the possibilities and the promise of being involved in the Underground Railroad and trying to gain your freedom. But I think what we tend to forget is that not everyone has this kind of success. And the physical danger, the possibility of capture, is very high for most individuals. Most people who attempt to escape are unsuccessful. And the repercussions for the lack of success for being recaptured are very high. Severe punishment comes their way for running away. They could be beaten, put in chains, branded with an R on their cheek for runaway, or even killed or maimed for making that choice. In addition, when one chooses to run away, you are by definition putting your friends and family in jeopardy. Because it means that as they try to figure out where you went, how you escape, they go to your family members. They go to people who know you. And they will attempt to extract information from them in any way that they can. So this choice is not one that just affects you directly, but affects those who you love and hold most dear. But also it means that you're giving up your relationship with people who have been a part of your life, all of your life. You may never see your mother or your father again. You may never see your children again. You may never see that community that's been an important place of support for you for many long years. So this choice, this decision to get involved in escape is not a simple one. And the losses can be extreme. The heartache can be very painful. And I think for many people that choice is a very difficult one to make. And you read about that very often in some of the stories of those who make that choice to run away. For example, William Wells Brown, who's a very active person in the Underground Railroad and in abolitionism, is in the institution of slavery for a very long time, and he hates it from the very beginning. But what prevents him from running away, what prevents him from capturing his own freedom, is that he refuses to leave behind his mother and his sister. They are on different plantations, but he's allowed to have contact with them, and he cannot bear to leave them behind. It's only when both his sister and then his mother are sold away further south that he decides to take that step. And only then when they tell him not to worry about them, but to worry about his own freedom and his own future. And their last words to him before he saw them shipped down further south was, "Seek your freedom." At that stage, he does decide to make that step. But it is his connection to his family, his bonds to his mother and his sister that keep him in that institution, and I'm sure keep many others there as well. I think also the perilous nature of making this kind of a choice is also highlighted through the laws that exist in this country during that time period. The law essentially was set up to help those who wanted to recapture slaves and to put the force of the legal system against those who choose to run away and those who choose to support them. In fact, there are two laws passed during this period that are critical in this nature. The first is a Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1793 about the time of the Constitution, and a second one passed again in 1850. And in essence, what these laws do is to make it a crime to support those who try to escape and gain their freedom. They placed all African Americans living in this country in jeopardy for their future, especially with the passage of the 1850 law, because it assumes that as an African American in this country, north or south, that it assumes that you are a slave or a runaway. And it's on your shoulders to prove that you are free and deserve to be protected and not returned back into slavery. In addition, according to these laws, if you were accused by a slave catcher or a slave owner, you did not have the right to testify in court in your own behalf. You had to find someone white who might speak for you. The laws also made it hard on those who chose to try to step forward to either support you or to help those who were running away. If a person was caught aiding a runaway slave, they could be arrested and put on trial. They could be fined up to $1,000 and 6 months in jail for each individual that you might help. And you could also go to civil court and be sued for up to $1,000 per individual that you helped as well. Often slaveholders would use this device as a way of harassing individuals who are trying to help runaways gain their freedom. So you can see the power of the law, the power of our legal institution was set up to make it difficult and treacherous for those who chose to help those escaping. In fact, there are several individuals who found themselves taken to court and sued under these laws. One well-known one is Thomas Garrett, an abolitionist who lives in Delaware and around Philadelphia. He helps a family of 5 escape and go northward to Philadelphia. Their owner eventually takes him to court and sues him for $5,000 for aiding his family of 5 for running away. He's found guilty. As a consequence, part of his property is sold away, and he's deprived of part of his ability to earn a living. But to his credit, I think Garrett is a stalwart believer in these concepts. And at the trial itself, after he's been fined, he says that I see this fine as a license to me to continue to help those seeking freedom. And any of you who know someone else seeking freedom, send them to me. So it's that kind of strength of character, I think that kind of dedication, that's part of what makes this Underground Railroad system so powerful and so important. But I think these successful cases did make it a difficult choice for people to make, but we continue to have people across the country who step forward in this way. People like Levi Coffin, who in Ohio is well known for his activities, a Quaker, and sometimes called the president of the Underground Railroad. Thomas Garrett in Delaware, a guy by the name of William Lloyd Garrison, who lives, I think, in this area. Delia Webster, who's in Kentucky, And John Rankin, again in Ohio, Reverend John Rankin, who's very well known for his work. He is a Methodist minister born in Tennessee who eventually moves to Ohio because his mother hates the institution of slavery and raises him in that mindset. So when he becomes a minister, his first work with his congregation is in Tennessee to preach against the institution of slavery. As you can imagine, his parishioners were not exactly thrilled by that. And as I like to say delicately, he was encouraged to find work elsewhere. And he eventually moves to Ohio, in Ripley, Ohio, just east of Cincinnati, where he forms his own church. But what's important about him in this context is that one of the most disappointing moments in his life is when he learns that his brother, raised by the same mother, decides to purchase slaves. He's incredible. He's incredulous about this and cannot believe that it's happening. So to try to persuade his brother to give up this onerous work, he writes a series of letters to him talking about the institution of slavery and illustrating why this institution is not a good thing. These letters are finally bound into a book that's published all across the country. And according to William Lloyd Garrison, it was reading this book that had a huge influence upon his own thinking about slavery and abolitionism and helped to encourage him to take up the work that he does so ably here in Boston. So this connection, this network is very large, and the influence back and forth is very important. But I think as we talk about those in the white community who are very supportive of the Underground Railroad, it's important not to overlook the African-American community itself and the people there who are a critical part of the success of this institution. They are the real heart, I think, of the Underground Railroad, because more likely than not, this is where runaways are first likely to go as they're trying to find freedom in a safe haven. Also, African Americans tend to be the individuals most likely to go south to bring people northward to freedom. And there are great examples of this. Probably the best well-known one is Harriet Tubman, who goes south many different times, helping individuals gain their freedom and come northward to a better life. But beyond those individuals, that African-American community is also critical in terms of this process. Because where there are large numbers of African-Americans living together, runaways know one thing for sure. There are sympathetic people, institutions, and beliefs in those communities that will support them and protect them. And particularly the institutions across those communities are critical supporters of those who run away when they get into their cities. And these are churches like Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, the Union Baptist Church in Cincinnati, and the African American Meeting House right here in Boston. As Beverly talked about earlier, it's those communities, those individuals who are critical in allowing for the success of those who escape. They are the ones who take them into their homes. They are the ones that provide them with food and clothing and take the risk often to help them gain their freedom. In fact, in Cincinnati, the rest of the abolitionist community often argues that many times when runaways come into Cincinnati, it's the African-American community that organizes most of the activities and enlists their support along the way. But it's clear that that's the place first that most of those who run away turn to for support. The other thing is that there are important individuals in that community, I think, who stand out as important leaders in terms of helping those escape, gain that freedom. Again, there are people all throughout the country, people like William Still in New Jersey, George the Baptiste in Indiana, Lewis Hayden right here in Massachusetts, and again in Ohio. I have to forgive my Ohio bias, but I'm out in Ohio. There's John Parker. John Parker is an African-American who lives also in the town of Ripley, Ohio with John Rankin. But he himself was a slave who ran away 3 times and was recaptured each time and punished for making that attempt. His saving grace, though, is that he has skills in ironworking. And as a consequence, his owner does not punish him so severely that he can't work. And eventually, he's sold to a woman who allows him to earn enough money to buy his freedom. At that moment, then, he leaves the institution of slavery, I think, in Kentucky, moves to Ohio, to Cincinnati for a little while, then goes to Ripley, Ohio, where he creates his own business of iron molding. Now, when he first gets there, he has no interest at all in helping runaway slaves. As much as he hated the institution, he didn't want to have any involvement with it. But soon he's encouraged, cajoled, I should say, by a friend of his who wants him to go back to Kentucky to help him bring his daughters out of slavery. Well, at first, John Rankin turns him down. He says, look, I've got plenty to do. I've got a family. I've got a house. I've got things to worry about. I don't want to get engaged in this. But the person continues to badger him and talk to him and persuade him. And finally, John agrees to go. The irony, though, is that the night they agreed to go ahead and do this, the man doesn't show up. But John goes himself and finds the daughters and brings them back to freedom. At that moment, he's now hooked. And from then on, for the next 20 years, almost nightly, he rows across the Ohio River into Kentucky looking for individuals who are trying to gain their freedom. And he becomes well known for his involvement in this. In fact, there are rewards put out for him, wanted dead or alive, for his involvement in these kinds of activities. But he continues to it despite that. He describes his life in Ripley in an interesting way. He says that when he walks down the street of Ripley, especially at night, he would wear guns on either side of his hip. And he would not walk on the sidewalk, but would walk in the middle of the street. So that way, if any slave catcher was going to get him, he had to step out and be seen to do that. Well, none ever does step forward to engage him. In the course of his work, and in the course of the work of John Rankin between them, they're able to help thousands of individuals to gain their freedom. Now, what's important for us to keep in mind is that while everyone was not as adventurous or as engaged directly in the Underground Railroad as some of the people that I've described, it's important for us to keep in mind the variety of individuals who are engaged in this. As I noted earlier, they came from all walks of life and from a variety of backgrounds, a very interracial group of people. It includes freedmen who had escaped slavery, who were ready to step forward to be supportive, Quakers, Native Americans, Latinos, women, men, a wide variety of people who were part of this Underground Railroad movement. And their focus was to help runaways to gain their safety. And the way this would often work is they'd move them from house to house, place to place in the dark of night, so that they couldn't be traced and they could not be followed by others. And that's why when I first described this, I talk about a very loosely organized system. Because what is key to the success of the Underground Railroad is the idea of secrecy. That you may know one or two people, but you don't know all the people in that network. So if you're captured or you are intercepted, you can only give up so much information about how that system works. And I think it's that makes it so successful and makes it work so well and allows it to operate fairly effectively and efficiently in certain parts of the country. I think secrecy is what made them all safe and functional in the work that they did. The other thing, though, why they turned to this level of secrecy and this level of organization is that involvement in the Underground Railroad, involvement in helping those run away, was in fact dangerous to one's well-being. Again, talking with Beverly, she described to me some of the issues that people ran into in terms of public confrontation as far north as New York and Boston, when individuals would publicly take a position against slavery, and how people would warn them about not doing it, that William Lloyd Garrison had to be protected very often when he moved even through this city. Well, imagine what it was like if you lived in a place like Ohio, along the Ohio River, just across the border from Kentucky. For those people, the Civil War began 30 years before 1860 because their lives were in constant peril as slave catchers came back and forth across the river looking for runaways, but launching attacks upon those people they thought were part of this system. And in particular for the African-American community, it was very dangerous. People died and were murdered because of suspected involvement in the Underground Railroad, and the laws were not set up to protect them. So as we think about this system, as we think about the work that people are doing, you have to understand the kind of commitment, the kind of effort that people were putting forward to be a part of this system. It was not easy. It was challenging and sometimes painful and sometimes even fatal for some individuals. And I think it's because of this danger that it's so hard to reconstruct and understand how the Underground Railroad functioned and who were all the players that were a part of it. And that's also why I think it's important to always highlight and research the background and the history and the individuals and the places that were part of the Underground Railroad. Because first of all, what it does is to bring to life the impact that this system was having in this nation, symbolically and in reality. Because even the symbolism of having this happen, of individuals choosing to have their freedom, was an important one against the South. Also, it illustrates how it changed people's lives as a consequence of working in collaboration with others. And it also shows how the different places that we sometimes take for granted today were critical locations for the success of this institution. I think what the Underground Railroad does for us is it represents people who believed it was important to get involved in the issues of their time. They were not willing to stand by and just let things happen. They felt they had a right, a duty to get engaged. I think they are activists and individuals and people that we could all emulate and should all admire. And I think it makes it very clear that the decisions that people make can have an impact upon their lives, upon the lives of others, and also upon the society of which they are part. How they chose to lead their lives made a difference for themselves, for others, for their society. It changed the meaning of other individuals' lives. It changed the meaning of their own lives. And it changed the direction and the destiny of a nation. Because if you think of the Underground Railroad and abolitionism as an attack upon the institution of slavery, in one sense, they were victorious. In fact, the institution was brought to its knees. And I think these are lessons well worth knowing, understanding, and duplicating as we think about our own lives. Probably, I think, one of the most important aspects of the history of the Underground Railroad is the legacy that it offers to all of us. It offers all of us a guide as to how we can make a difference in our own lives and in the world of which we are part, both yesterday and, more importantly, today. It offers timeless lessons about how we all can benefit from studying and understanding the activities, the dedication of others through history. And that is why I am glad, very glad, to have had the opportunity to join you today as you recognize Mariah Stewart and David Walker. They are the kind of people whose principles we need to hold high and to honor, whose spirit and dedication we must remember and keep alive. I salute you for your efforts on this occasion in honoring two important historic figures whose efforts and activities we should always keep burning brightly as examples of what is possible when one decides to get engaged and make a difference in their world, and to think about how we can emulate their activities, their dedication in our own lives and our world today. Thank you.
I thought we might provide a few moments if there are any questions that you have about the Freedom Center.
Yes.
Please use the mic. Just contribute to the Freedom Center and to sort of encourage people?
I think you need to repeat that so everyone can hear you.
Can you offer some guidance to people who live all the way back on the East Coast to how we might support the Freedom Center, both financially or otherwise?
The question is what I could suggest to people to think about in terms of supporting the Freedom Center financially and otherwise. Well, the easiest thing to do is send money. One of the things I do encourage you to do is to go to our webpage, which is very simple, freedomcenter.org. And I think it gives you a clearer sense of what we are as an organization. I think we are a little bit larger, a little bit more complex, a little bit more involved than people can realize that we are. And the important thing about the story we're trying to tell comes out of the points that I was making today is that we're not just looking at the past, but very much interested in how we inspire people to get engaged in today's world. How we find ways for people to take steps large and small to make that world a little bit better. So the one way you can do it clearly is through financial support, buying a membership or something like that. But in the larger picture, what we hope is that people will begin to think about their responsibility in today's world and what kinds of things you can do to make this world, this environment a little bit better. It could be what you do around Katrina. It could be what you do in your own community. But we are really interested in the idea of social engagement and civic responsibility and how people take that more and more seriously to get this world a little bit closer to the kind of world we want it to be. So I offer you those sort of thoughts about the Freedom Center and what we're trying to accomplish.
There is an organization I know you must have heard of, Facing History in Ourselves.
I'm sorry?
Facing History in Ourselves, an organization that got started in Boston but really has a national presence. That really, with a different factual focus, has very similar focus to what you're talking about. Are you aware of them?
I don't know a lot about it.
Okay.
I've sort of heard the name before, but I
Okay.
don't know the details of it.
Yeah, it would be an interesting synergy to see what work could be done together.
Well, our interest is in finding alliances and organizations to work with. We have our own sort of approach that we call freedom stations, which are places across the country who have similar points of view, similar goals in mind, and trying to find ways to work together, not seeing ourselves as the leader so much as maybe the portal to which we can get those kind of connections taking place.
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. That's it? Okay.
I just wondered what you were doing. Are you having are there satellite Underground Railroad centers in other parts of the country? Are you all doing anything on the East Coast in terms of that we might learn about and support?
Yeah, we're trying to form relationships in a variety of places. I'm always careful about how we describe the freedom stations because I liken it to being a lot like the Underground Railroad in the 19th century, in that no one controls any individual one, but you have some commonalities that you try to work together with, and that's what we're trying to do as well, is find places with which whom we have commonalities, then in each instance trying to figure out what relationship makes sense in that setting. But we're doing things in Philadelphia, Beverly and I have been talking here in Boston, we're doing things in New York, we're doing things in California. We're really trying to have connections all across the country and see how we can then interconnect each other so that this work that we're doing can reinforce each other. It could be, for example, the wonderful exhibition that you have here on William Lloyd Garrison. It might be something we could circulate within that group of organizations because of that commonality of point of view. The other thing that we were just talking about is that recently there was an opera done of the life of Margaret Garner that was commissioned by the Detroit Opera, the Cincinnati Opera, and the Philadelphia Opera. Margaret Garner is the woman featured in the book Beloved, who chooses to kill her child rather than have her go back into slavery. They did an opera around it, a very powerful, tragic opera. And we found that a really wonderful vehicle for creating activities and connections in those communities that bring together like-minded institutions. So I think all those kinds of things are the kind of activities we're hoping to look to do, but trying to find the right connection in each community. But again, if you want to learn more about it, the webpage is really pretty wonderful, and it tells you about the Freedom Stations, where they are, and what they're doing. One of the things we're doing right now is that one of our Freedom Station colleagues is in River Road, Louisiana, which is just down near New Orleans. And they have become a location for displaced people from the city of New Orleans. And what we've been trying to do is to get our network of Freedom Stations to send the kind of support they need to help those individuals. And at first, the first 2 or 3 days, it was food and clothing. Well, that's all been pretty much handled. Now there are other kinds of things that they're looking to try to get to help them moving forward. Part of it's money, so they can keep the electricity going. Part of it is just laptop computers, so they can help get information and get these onto a bulletin board so people can find their families. So I think we're trying to figure out in each instance what kinds of things we can do that are supported to those institutions at a particular time in their own existence. Mariah. If your question is whether we give out grants, no. We're just trying to keep the doors open. But I think there are organizations that are doing that. I think that we're trying to find ways to help funnel resources towards those places as we're trying to funnel resources to ourselves as well. I mean, we've only been open a year. We opened a year ago in August. So we're just beginning to get, I tell people we're sort of like a newly born fawn, that when it first is born, it's wobbling and trying to get its balance. That's where we are now. I think we need a little bit more time to get a little bit more stable, but I think part of the goal is what you talk about. How can we find mutual ways of finding resources for both ourselves and for those with whom we work? And I think that's part of our dream for the future, is that we can find those kind of connections that help everyone involved.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, great.
I was saying that I may be one of the several teachers in the room, and very important to hear what you have to say in terms of the teaching I do. And one of my questions is, how many of stations had been documented by historical researchers before you began, and how many more have people brought to your attention? And does this pose difficulties in terms of documenting the actual existence of the stations? And you were saying about folklore and stories, and we heard this was a station, and we think it was. And how do you handle that?
Well, the one thing I'll say is that what I find always interesting is that during the time of the Underground Railroad, nobody wanted to admit to being part of the Underground Railroad. Now, 100 years later, everybody's a part of it. So you're right, the mythology is very, very strong. And we purposely have stayed out of the business of documenting and authenticating Underground Railroad locations. The Park Service has an arm of its activities that does do that process. I think to date they probably have authenticated somewhere around 20 to 25 places, but there are hundreds across the country. And I think the challenge is getting beyond the local word of mouth and beliefs to finding the documents to make that happen. We prefer not to get into that business because it is just, as you can imagine, full of pitfalls along the way. So what we'll do is the Park Service authenticates them, we'll do that, and often if people want to share information with us, we'll make that available for others to look at it and to follow up themselves. But you're right, there's just lots and lots of possibilities across the country. You have someone behind you?
There's a question that speaks to textbooks. One thing that was brought to my attention last year, when we go to events like this, we hear versions of history. But the problem is that there are a certain amount of high school textbooks and post-secondary textbooks that are published en masse from someplace in Texas, and it's edited, and this information is not found there. Could I do some research, possibly on your website, to show me what kind of resources should I steer my attention at the school that I work at as far as getting textbooks that have your substantial information?
I don't know if we have on our web page that level of information. I think you can do research on the topic, or at least get led to research on the topic through the web page. I think the interesting thing is a lot of textbooks make quick reference to it, is the depth of information. And I think very often that relies upon the teachers to want to pursue it in more depth. What I have been involved in is an organization called the National Council for History Education. And one of the things we try to do is to create workshops and places where teachers can get more in-depth information about this topic so they can incorporate it into their work in the classroom. One of the things we're doing, at least in the Cincinnati region right now, is we have teacher workshops on a pretty regular basis, teacher institutes. And what we do in those institutes is to bring in teachers and really give them information, bring in speakers to talk about, we're focused on the Underground Railroad, but also on the issue of freedom and diversity. So we'll bring in lead speakers to come talk about those things so the teachers can figure out how to do it in the classroom in a way that's effective. I think one of the challenges is that people are worried that if they handle it wrong, they get beat up, or they come under duress. And so part of our goal is to try to help them come up with ways to use it in the classroom that hopefully not too many people are offended, but you also get the information out in a way that's useful for those who are engaged. So that I think we're trying to start small. Our hope is as we go forward, those institutes will be things we can at least then make available to the Freedom Stations. So that at least the prototype, the boilerplate, is available to then be offered. Here's what we did, here's the speaker we had, we can give that person's name, and maybe they'll come out and do the same thing for you. So that's part of the larger set of plans we have as we go forward. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
We end our programs in many ways, but there are a few acknowledgments that I want to make. First of all, we would never know as much as we do about Mariah Stewart without the scholarship of Marilyn Richardson. Marilyn? I'd also suggest that if you're local to this region, the first thing you should do is join the Museum of Afro-American History to make sure you are a member of the museum. We do, and part of the reason that I wanted Spencer to come here was to see the Garrison exhibit as we talk about touring it around the country, to see the kinds of things that we can do and partner in the future. These moments are incredibly important moments, this remembering the past in significant ways and marking these places. Place is a very important thing. If we don't know that place is important, Katrina has taught us nothing. Place means everything. For those of us who have ever been to New Orleans, we have a sense of the smells, of the food, of the people, of the quarter. And now we have a very different and broader sense of the tragedy of losing place and the tenuous nature of place against the forces of water. So I ask you to think about the work that the Heritage Guild has done in the past and will do in the future. I'm a new member of the Guild, but those who have been there for quite some time have done a tremendous job. And so we need to remember them and thank them for the work that they've done in the past. We end our programs in many ways, but I think it's an important one to end it with a song. I would ask Tracy Gibbs, our Director of Marketing and Membership, to come forward to lead us out of this place.
I do many things at the museum. It's fitting to sing one of the spirituals, the Underground Railroad, isn't it? Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Ohio. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. My Lord, He calls me. He calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. And I ain't got long to stay here. So I'll steal away, steal away, steal away to Boston. I'll steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Green trees are bending, poor sinner stands a-trembling, and the trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long, I ain't got long, I ain't got long to stay here.
When you work for the Museum of Afro-American History, you have to be multi-talented. I want to thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Spencer.